So recently someone asked Splitsuit, why is it really good to bet really small on the flop and then overbet the turn? And Splitsuit gave this really curious answer where he kind of argues that, you bet really small on the flop and your opponent continues a large part of your range, and then when you overbet the turn, they're going to overfold. And so then he also says,
even though that first initial smaller bet typically isn't going to be auto-profitable because there is all of that extra continuance, the larger follow-up bet tends to be auto-profitable because your opponent is folding such a large number of combos.
And the problem with this advice is that it's exactly the opposite of why GTO chooses these sizings. Usually when GTO is choosing to make a small bet, a quarter, a third, when it's in position, it's doing so because our opponent is going to fold way too often to the bet size, and the bet is auto-profitable. Because if it wasn't auto-profitable, then why would GTO do it with its entire range? So let's look at this model where we raise on the button, our opponent calls us, and we are allowed to make a bunch of different bet sizings across different streets. Our opponent can have different raise sizes, they can donk. So essentially they can strategically just do everything against us, right? How should play proceed? Well, we should be betting virtually 100% of our range with a 14 sizing, which means 25% of the pot. And so here, when I bet 20% of the pot, from a mathematical perspective, to prevent me from auto-profiting by betting any two cards, my opponent should defend at least 80% of his range. This percentage is known as the minimum defense frequency. As we can actually see here, my opponent, against my range bet, should fold 30% of the time, meaning he should be folding 10% more than the minimum defense frequency. And so basically, when you ask, when should I bet small in position, it's any time that your entire range can pick up this free auto-profit money because your opponent does not have enough hands that have equity on a king-high board that can continue even against your itty-bitty bet. Okay? So very often the reason you are going to be betting very small with your entire range is because all of your range now becomes instantaneously auto-profitable, and even if you bet your entire range, your opponent can't do jack about it. Okay? So it's not that, right, the turn is auto-profitable because GTO is never going to take a less EV line on the flop and hope to recoup the money on the turn. It's because the flop is immediately profitable. Okay? Splitsuit also says,
you definitely want to make sure you're doing some mathematical exploration between sessions to really figure out where you can start raising more profitably, both against that flop c-bet and also against that turn bet. And I really like raising that turn bet against players who tend to c-bet that smaller size way too often on the flop and then don't really rein in their double barrel range. It can be a very, very nice call flop, check raise turn and print some very, very easy auto profit.
The problem with this advice is it's the opposite of what you should do. Okay? Why is it that on a turn, your opponent is going to overbet against you in the first place? Is it because the turn was bad for his range? Or is it because the turn was good for his range? So, for example, let's bet small on the flop, and, what's going to be a card that's really obviously good for the in-position player's range? I'm probably going to say it's going to be the Queen of Spades, which is going to give the in-position player, all the combinations of king-queen, pocket queens itself, and it's generally just going to improve a lot of those, double Broadway hands into a lot of very strong gut shots, etc. So let's say it is the Queen of Spades and our opponent checks to us, and indeed we can see that on the turn, the overbet sizing, betting 110 into a pot of 83, is going to be the preferred sizing on the turn. When we overbet, how often should our opponent raise us on the turn? When he has slow played 8s, slow played 3s, a little bit when he has king-queen, but not that often. A little bit when he's turned Queen 8, but not that often. And even when you can see when this is, proportional to weight, there's just really not that many hands where we should be check raising on the turn with. And in fact, why is it that we shouldn't be check raising that much on the turn, it's because, well, when your opponent now bets the turn and he chooses the overbet sizing, what hands is he doing that with? He's doing it with aces, ace-king, king-queen, right? The draws. But he's generally doing it with a very polarized range of hands. He's not doing it that often with a hand like naked king-7. If your opponent is now polarizing his range so that it's either really, really strong hands and then bluffs that are complete air, what is the point of raising the turn? If your opponent has the nuts, now you're just going to be spewing into him, and if he has air, then you are losing the opportunity to check call on the turn and then check call on the river. So the common reaction to how do I play against these players who are going small bet on the flop, overbet the turn, is to somehow play back with a lot of aggression yourself. But this is just really not often going to be the case. So for example, even if we bet 14% with the overwhelming majority of our range, right, the correct play is actually to give us respect, overfold by 10% on the flop, and look how often our opponent should be raising us, maybe, like 10 to 12% of the time. That's actually, if you look at mass database analysis, about how often your opponents raise you in real life. And as you can see, in this model, our opponent should often be just flatting with king 3 suited. So when our opponent even has 2 pair, he should be slow playing that probably more often than people are slow playing that in real life. In real life, probably people are going to be check raising king queen a little bit too often and not defending their check calling range enough. So when you are facing an opponent who's, range betting a lot on the flop, you have to recognize the reason they're allowed to range bet on the flop is because that flop was advantageous to them in the first place, so you need to kind of get the F out of their way. When they blast you on the turn with the overbet, there's not that much reason to raise there because, again, they're mostly going to be representing a very strong polarized range. If we go into piosolver and look at the hotness comparison and see how our opponent should respond to an overbet across all of these boards, we can see there's not a single board where our opponent should be check raising the turn with when the turn is obviously really good for our opponent in allowing for a check raise in the first place. If the turn was a turn that was really intimidating and one that, we should have a lot of check raises on, well, guess what? That's probably a turn that your opponent wasn't going to be overbetting anyways, right? So this advice makes very, very little sense, and in general, this always leads me to the same conclusion, is that there's no real reason to take qualitative advice in poker. The real way to learn is to get a solver, learn how to make models, learn how to take your human reads and turn them into, good pre-flop ranges and node locks, and use quantitative advice rather than qualitative advice to climb up through the ranks, because qualitative advice, even from famous coaches, is often going to do the exact opposite of what is what GTO recommended. But if you have a solver in the first place and you have learned to read it and interpret it and, really kind of master this application, then you can teach yourself poker and make it to the highest limits without a human telling you, oh yeah, when you have king queen, you should be raising X or Y percentage of the time. Anyways, hope this was helpful. If you want to hear more about my crazy poker rants, please check out overnightmonster.com, where I have released my second course on how to play exploitative poker called The Bluff Barbarian. Anyways, hope this helped you guys improve your understanding of the game. Peace out.